YZ Chin is here. She's the author of Go Home, not Go Home is our feminist press anthology, Though I Get Home, which is also published by the Feminist Press. YZ's book is the winner of the Louise Merriweather First Book Prize, which celebrates women and non-binary women of color. Her book has received widespread critical acclaim for its multidimensional exploration of Malaysia and the difficult journey towards finding a voice. We actually ran an interview with YZ on our website with Mira T. Lee, and she called the book a subversive take on the immigrant stories we've come to expect from, quote, immigrant writers. YZ is also the author of 2 poetry chapbooks, Deter and Passing. And she was born and raised in Taiping, Malaysia, and speaks 3 languages. Like another reader tonight, she has a full day job that has almost nothing to do with writing. She's an engineer during the day, and she writes at night. And we're super pleased to welcome her to the workshop. So give her a big round of applause.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I just want to say, that's okay. Thank you. I'm short. Really appreciate being here. I've been here quite a few times, been personally enriched by the events here, so I think this is a really great space. And just, on today of all days, I think it's meaningful and special to be here. Like last year when the travel ban was first announced, my husband and I were traveling back from Malaysia, and we were detained at JFK for 2.5 hours, something like that. But then, shortly after returning home, I saw that AAW The Margins, which is an online literary space, put out like a rapid response call in response to the ban, and I felt very heartened by the fact that there are organizations and people working to stand with what are being defined as literal outsiders that we are keeping outside. Anyway, that's my spiel. But yeah, Go Home is a really good book too. I've read it, it's great. I came to the launch here in this space, it's great. My book is Though I Get Home, and it's from an Emily Dickinson poem. So I'm gonna do something a little bit different. I've never read it this way before, but I'm gonna read you the first 2 pages of the book, a snippet from the middle, and the last page, bypassing like a twist in the book, but hopefully it will still be coherent. Hunger pinned her to the bunk. Starvation impaled her through the stomach, keeping her down on the thin mattress, resisting the momentum of her feebly raised head. Her neck strained to bring her vision to the requisite level, such that she could observe the movement of sun against her prison walls. The sun was her way of telling time and estimating the next delivery of food. Not that it mattered now. It was the 3rd week into her detention without trial. She did feel secure, as if nothing would have ever happened to her again, until death. The days lost their shape, shedding the definition of hours and minutes. Her body, too, lost its shape, pulling downward, lowering her center of gravity, rooting her toward dirt and dust. They said she was staging a hunger strike. Isa, on her part, felt that the refusal of food was really to make life behind bars more interesting. The meals they brought to her cell were markers of time, and she had looked forward to the packets of rice and gravy as daily celebrations. But then she'd started feeling like a Pavlovian dog. The nods of the men who handed her sustenance became sinister, laced with degradation. She resented the regular reminders of her weakness and dependency. After minutes of work, she managed to prop herself on one elbow. A rolling wave of dizziness lurched her, listing, tipping. She smiled. In her teenage years, when she had lived a sheltered life, she had tried many times, each attempt lasting days or weeks or months, to go on a diet. It didn't much matter what kind of diets they were, or how much science was behind them. The hope was what she needed. She wished, on the other side of each experiment, to find a slim, beautiful her standing still with folded hands, waiting. And now, locked away, she would finally obtain the thinnest body of her life. She dreamed, still smiling, of her wafer physique, gliding effortlessly among obstacles thrown up by invisible enemies. Anything, anybody erected against her, she slipped past with a slight sideways turn of her frame. Her arms extend a ramrod above her head, as if surrendering, but really evading, winning. She came to, and was disappointed to feel that she was again flat on her back, her previous progress negated. Shadows swam before her eyes. She opened them. Men. Men were leaning over her, explaining something, but not to her, to each other, or maybe to an unseen observer. Rank air filled her nose. Rolling her eyes upward, she caught the glance of one man who started talking faster. Hands pressed down on her shoulders, pinning them. A hand touched her lips. Isa suddenly wondered what clothes she was wearing, whether she wore any. Another pair of hands caught hold of her ankles. Her mind, wandering, entertained the absurd vision of a single many-limbed being. It paused its speech when it extended hands and fists to restrain her, but now it started up again. Isa thought it might be expecting a response from her, but she could not understand it. When she opened her mouth to tell it so, fingers slipped through and scratched her lips. She gagged and mush rushed in, filling her. Of course she tried to spit. Of course she thrashed. At first. Then the mush began to acquire flavor and become more than texture. It tasted first like somebody else's vomit, and then like her own. And then it became her, and she was being force-fed herself. She reclosed her eyes. Up floated a piece of advice from her dead father, given a lifetime ago. What to do when overpowered by a criminal, such as a robber or a rapist. Do not fight. Survival should be your only focus. Everything other than your continued breathing, be it jewelry, money, body, honor, is expendable. Save your life. Do not fight. Oatmeal. That was what they were forcing into her mouth. I'm going to skip ahead to the middle, and that was a passage about the main character who is arrested without trial for writing subversive poetry. Sorry. When she was 9, her mother had caught her with fruit stolen from their neighbor's tree. Young Isa defended herself, explaining that although the guava tree had roots stemming from the neighbor's compound, its branches stuck their way over the fence into what was technically their house, so it wasn't really stealing, right? For this bit of talking back, her mother had made her wait in the living room while she went off to fetch a rattan cane. When she came back, she instructed Isa to display her right palm, holding it outstretched and face up. Then her mother showed her how to steady the upturned palm by encircling her left fingers in a tight grip around her right wrist, and even helpfully demonstrated this offering of the right palm by the left to prevent the diving board effect. The diving board effect, her mother went on to explain, happened when the cane came whipping down on the palm and the palm could not withstand the force, thus drooping to an angle that made it cumbersome to deliver the next strike, and the next, and the one after that, without unnecessary delay. It was more efficient if Isa used both hands to support the target palm and keep it horizontal. Then it would be over quicker. It began. After about 10 strokes, both hands started their descent toward the ground anyway, and her mother, impatient, clucked for her to turn around. As soon as Isa's back was to her mother, the tears flowed. Before Isa had time to think, to feel a smidgen of pride at keeping the tears unseen, she was wailing hysterically against her will. But she did what she was told well enough, despite the crying, lifting up her pinafore and holding hands out at her sides, a fistful of fabric in each. The hem pressed into her right palm, and it burned. Now the cane came down again and again, and This time, she could not see its arc to brace herself. Her knees quaked. There was a horrible crunching sound, and her first thought was that her mother had broken her bones. But it was only the rattan cane snapping in half. And now I will read the last page. And I just want to say that the book has funny bits too. It's not all no doom and oppression. All right. She left her mother, saying she needed a bath. When she reached the bathroom, she pressed a button in the middle of the doorknob. It sank down easily under her thumb. The door was supposedly locked now, but who knew? It didn't have throw latches or slide bolts, unlike those visual affirmations available on the door of her cell, which she had lived in for so many months. She averted her eyes from the huge mirror and stripped, tugging fast and rough. Somewhere in the cicada's kingdom under the moon, a car engine rumbled deep, the dark night's own hunger pangs. In the bathtub, she stood, hesitating. The hot shower dial was pointed to number 3. She had forgotten what that meant. She shivered, a whole body kind of violent vibration. A gust of night air pushed through the small barred window right next to the shower head. There was a covering for the window, thick, opaque glass that fit over the square like an airtight lid. But tonight, the glass lid was propped wide open. Maybe someone had been wiping down the frames to prevent rusting. Isa peered out at the smooth black sky marred by acne stars, wondering if anyone could see her, if anyone was watching. Maybe up there, on the waist of the hill, where the mound nipped in as if corseted. Maybe on the top floor of the house 2 doors down, with binoculars adjusting. She turned on the shower. A stream shattered itself against her body, fragments scattering off. The window stayed open, funneling in breezes, counteracting water that was too hot. Let them watch. Here she was, shallow scabs and mottled bruises. She was utterly alone, even if they were out there keeping tabs on her. Like a fish launched up higher than it had ever been before, by the tallest wave it had ever seen, then stranded on the beach, no wave strong enough now to go that far again and bring it back home. Here she was, Isabella Sin, poet and revolutionary. They had given her those titles, and she had accepted them. Now she simply had to become who she was. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading. Yeah, in the Q&A, it will become clear why this character has been given the title of poet and revolutionary, and it's sort of an interesting reversal, not what you would expect. I want to introduce our next amazing speaker tonight. We have Jon Pineda here, and he's going to read from Let's No One Get Hurt, his new book from FSG, which tells the story of a 15-year-old girl named Pearl, a girl who squats on abandoned property in the American South with her father after her mother leaves them. Not a woman yet, but not a girl, Pearl calls herself, a poem no one will ever translate. Jon Pineda is the author of multiple works of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. His 2010 memoir, Sleep in Me, was a Barnes & Noble Discover Great Writers selection. And his 2013 novel, Apology, was the winner of the Milkweed National Fiction Prize. Like all of our readers tonight, he's also a poet. He's the author of the award-winning poetry collections Little Anodynes, The Translator's Diary, and Birthmark. He teaches at the College of William and Mary and is a core faculty member in the Low Residency MFA program at Queen's University in Charlotte. And like C. Dale, he just came back from the Kundimon retreat, so I'm sure they'll have stories for us. Please welcome Jon.
Thank you. I'm going to start kind of not really in the middle of the book, but I'm not going to start on page 1. I'm just going to kind of jump in here. And I should mention that absent from Pearl's life is her mother, And I'm going to try to read some sections here where in memory you get to kind of hear the mother's voice here. Living in this abandoned boathouse along with Pearl and her father, who was a disgraced college professor, is these two other grown men, Dox and Fritter, their father and son. So you'll hear some reference to these two characters as well. Some days, it's only a few boiled eggs split 4 ways. Other days, it's a big dandelion salad and fried bullhead catfish netted fresh from the Sound. Fritter builds traps for crayfish, too. We gather, and still, it never seems like it's enough. I have to help Fritter set and empty the traps now because his legs sink the moment he takes the first step in the water. He's gotten stuck more than once in the soft mud near the banks. Once we had to tie a rope around him and then tie the other end to the rear bumper of the pickup. Dox was crying the whole time because he thought my father was going to hit the gas and pull half of Fritter's body off and leave the rest poking out of the mud. Other days, there's simply no food. I found you can eat the silence that grows inside a house. It gets so quiet, I can hear everyone breathing, and that's a feast for sure. I used to spy on Fritter until I realized all he ever did was paint the same thing over and over. Doc says Fritter is working on a mural, but the landscape has no faces or figures, none that I've been able to see. It's just a solid wall of black paint rising in increments like a river from the buckled floor of his room. Fritter takes an empty rifle cartridge, the long-range kind he used to shoot during his tours, and holds it flush with the wall. Above it, he paints a thin black line. Each line is the exact length of the bullet casing. On his knees, he works his way from wall to wall. I think of something my mother once told me when she was explaining a math problem. I didn't know it then, but she was using Zeno's dichotomy paradox as an example. Pearl, go to one end of the room and stand there. I did it. Okay, my mother said as she walked to the opposite end, directly across from me. I want you to try and reach me. But here's the catch. You can only go half the distance toward me with each attempt. Make sense? No. We both laughed. Come this way, she said, like I was in the deep end of the pool again and trying to reach her at the edge. Now stop there. I stood halfway from where I had just been. I studied the invisible line from where I was to where she still was. Now go again. I immediately walked halfway closer and stopped. I'm almost there. I smiled. Almost. Go halfway from there. I did it and was so close. I wanted to jump into her arms. I can almost reach you. Right. But here's where it gets tricky. You can only go half the distance each time. I looked down at my feet and shuffled them in place. Are you listening to me? Yes. What did I say? You said I can only go half the distance. Good. I stopped for a moment and studied her face. It was so serious, like she wanted to tell me something important. I'll never reach you. She smiled. Good girl. You're right. You'll never reach me. I was carrying one of Fritter's empty paint cans I had repurposed into a pail the first time I met Main Boy. He was standing in front of a large for sale sign in an open field, not even a quarter mile from where we were staying. The pail was already half filled with cattail roots, and I was going to boil them down until their middle softened so I could put them in a stew for Dox with whatever Fritter and I yanked from the traps that day. I crossed a gully grown over with pampas grass and followed a zigzagging line of pines. Wild onions would have been a nice accompaniment, but none were to be found. The trees eventually thinned near the edge of a fallow field. I remember spotting Main Boy where he was and thinking I was a safe distance, like I didn't exist yet in his mind. Main Boy remained planted in the middle of the field. He leaned against his glittery red golf cart. Once he saw me, though, he started waving and yelling to get my attention. I went from being invisible to something that could be touched. My heart shook like a fish in a net. Perhaps this is why I panicked and ran away. I didn't feel like being gutted alive. At one point, I dropped the pail and didn't go back for it. Later, only when the field was empty and dark, I scavenged the for sale sign. No one needed to be reminded the world could be bought. I asked my father if the precise term for what we were was squatters. He laughed and said, "God, no, Pearl. We're all artists here." Then he sat quietly for a moment. He later made the following amendment. "The truth is, everyone is a squatter. It's all borrowed, these bodies, our names. We don't give them back until we fuck them up properly." He nodded as if this were the final word on the matter, as if he had done his parental duty. Main Boy's real name is Mason Boyd, but I can't bring myself to call him that. He's Main Boy. It's meaningless. It fits him perfectly. He wanted to know if I lived nearby, and I shook my head and wouldn't speak. I wanted him to think I was feral. He asked me if I was going to start high school in the fall, and I grunted, which made us both laugh. He pulled his golf cart alongside me as I picked dandelions, pulling them from their roots while saving their buttery yellow heads. He said he was the president of a club that has a pretty big web presence. That was supposed to mean something. They post lots of videos they've shot themselves. He said I should subscribe to it, as if I could. I told him no thanks. It is only pranking videos now, but they want to expand into videos that teach people how to survive in the wilderness. I ask him what wilderness is left, and he says plenty. He and his friends think the world is going to get to a point where it will simply fall apart, where we won't have all the amenities we're used to. I smile at the word amenities. I ask him what their club is called, but he says it doesn't have an official name. Because it doesn't have an official name, I tell him they should call themselves flies. He doesn't like that idea. He doesn't think it would look good on a t-shirt. And I'm just going to jump ahead here to this last bit. "Come on, Pearl," Main Boy says. "Where are we going? Come get lost with us." He wants me to hang out, to go to at least one meeting. He says I can help them make more videos. I could be Wendy in this Lost Boys act of theirs. "Come on," Main Boy says. "They're going to love you." Who's going to love me? Everyone. I don't care about that. I don't care about that at all. He gives me a thumbs up like he can read my mind too. What? He doesn't answer. He tries to reach out. I brush his hand away, but he keeps at it until he rests his thumb against my bottom lip. He must think I'm stupid. If I were wild, his thumb would be gone by now. "You could be pretty hot if you wanted," he says. "Just saying." I lean back. He keeps his fist pressed in the air like there's a thick wall of glass between us. I see his lips moving, but I can't make out what he's saying. I feel like making a fist so I can break this fucking glass. Evenings, I trace the horizon with my fingertip. It's just a line where the river and the sky meet. Beyond this river is the sound, and beyond the sound is the ocean. Everything is barely holding on to the next thing. That's what I really want to tell Main Boy. Everything is barely holding on. Mostly, there's only quiet out here, even when Docs is noodling on the cigar box guitar, his slide fashioned out of a sliced wine bottleneck. He keeps at a song until he stops. He sometimes finishes what he starts, and sometimes he doesn't. It's an unspoken rule. My mother used to say that poems were never finished, that they were only abandoned. I like to take some things my mother said and flip them on their head. For instance, I think all abandoned things are poems. In this way, if this place where we live together is truly abandoned, then we are living inside a poem. My father says, I'm 15 going on 50. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's just so nice to hear that character spoken out loud. It's like the most gorgeous voice. And some of the best names, I think, that I've read in a novel in a really long time. Best names of characters. I'm really proud to introduce C. Dale Young, who's visiting New York right now. And tonight he'll read from The Affliction, which is actually his first book of fiction, right? Yeah, so before then it's all been poetry. And The Affliction is about, or it starts with a man with the strange ability to disappear. It also tells the story of a woman who sits in her kitchen forever replaying a past memory, and a character who's aware of his impending death while no one is aware of him. Weaving together lives of these characters in big cities like Los Angeles, Young gives voice to the daily happenings of those rendered invisible by the bustle. A review in Lambda Literary wrote, "The Affliction is a haunting book, one that is rooted in a binding, beautiful magic." As I said, Young is the prize-winning author of 4 collections of poetry, and he's been published in a lot of anthologies and magazines, including Best American Poetry, Asian American Poetry, The Next Generation, and the American Poetry Review. He was a recipient of the 2017-2018 Haynes Award from the Fellowship of Southern Writers, and he's also received fellowships from Breadloaf Writers Conference, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Based in San Francisco, he's a full-time medical practitioner and also a writing teacher, and we're really pleased to have him here tonight. Give him a big round of applause.
Hi there. I'm actually going to read from almost the dead center of this book. And there isn't really anything to set up except to tell you that the speaker, the narrator, is named Diego. And the other character, Link, is the one that was mentioned that is dying. And Link starts the dialogue. "You live next door to me?" "Yeah." "Is that why you talked to me that morning?" "No, man, I talked to you because you looked down and you almost walked into a garbage can. But you knew I lived next door to you." "Yeah, I saw when you moved in. You didn't bring much with you." Link looked down the beach beyond me and beyond the bench on which I was sitting. Some children were throwing a frisbee and yelling "fuck" every time one of them didn't catch it. "Why didn't you say anything?" "About what? About living next door?" "Yes, why didn't you? Look, man, when I first met you, you didn't seem like you wanted to talk. You practically ran away." Link turned and started walking away. In the distance, we heard once again, "Fuck! What is up with you, man? Is it a bad thing that I live next door?" I yelled as Link was already a good 10 feet away from me. Link didn't answer, nor did he stop walking. "I know you're sick," I said. Link stopped and turned around. "What?" "Dude, I know you a sick motherfucker. You drink all day long." Link didn't respond. He stared at me and then turned and began walking again. "I'm just kidding with you, man. Jesus, what is up with you? I'm just joking with you." "I'm sick. I'm really sick." Another of the frisbee kids yelled, "Fuck," followed by, "This frisbee's fucked up," followed by, "Who the fuck even makes this shit-ass frisbee?" Link likely had no idea why he had admitted to me that he was sick. He just kept walking. Later, I discovered he had not told anyone he was sick, and I'm probably the last person on earth to whom he had imagined telling this particular fact. It took him about 8 minutes to get to his house. He felt feverish. He felt warm, flushed almost. When he got to his kitchen, he fixed himself a mimosa. He felt sweaty, and the fever seemed to be consuming him then. He took off his shirt and realized it was wet with sweat. He had walked home slowly, so he hadn't expected this. He stripped down in the kitchen to his underwear. Sweat ran down his temples. As he walked into the living room, the doorbell rang. Link probably wasn't thinking. He opened the door to find me staring at him. Link stood in his own doorway, half naked and covered in sweat. He swayed slightly while standing there. He must have known then he was collapsing. It started in his knees. As I watched him pass out, it seemed to happen so slowly, I began to wonder if something was in fact wrong with my own head. I barely caught him. I carried him to his couch. You okay, man? What? You passed out cold, man. You just fell. Where? You're on your couch. I caught you before you hit the floor, man. I carried you over here. Get out. Wow, you're a really thankful guy. Seriously, you have to get out. What? You think I never seen a guy in his underwear? You need to. Man, I was just joking about you being sick and all, but you really are sick. You need to see a doctor. I've already been to doctors, but you're sick and you probably need to see a new doctor. I am sick, and I am dying. That's just the sickness talking smack, man. No, listen to me. Everything dies, and now I am dying. It sounded almost as if he were in a movie reciting a script. The poison had set in, and in the next scene, he would be clutching his chest while he vomited up yellow-green foam. This was melodrama at its finest, but he could not stop himself, and some part of me enjoyed it then. I looked at Link and tried my best to select the right words. I know of an old woman. You need to go see the old woman, Cassie. She can help you. No one can help me. Again, Link continued the drama with his short outburst, declaimed as if he were on a stage. Why does a man speak like this? I couldn't stop myself then from thinking in that way. Cassie can, I said. She cures all kinds of people. I can take you to her. She lives not far from where I grew up. All we have to do is fly to Antigua or St. Lucia and then charter a boat. I'm not going anywhere. Days later, Link felt better. The sweats had passed. He got up, showered, and went outside. He pulled the plastic lounge chair from out of the shade and positioned it at the bottom of the few steps to the patio, positioned it in direct sunlight, and then lay down on it. I watched him position that old tattered lounge chair. I could tell he was feeling better. Why are you all naked in your backyard, you perv? I called out to him from my side of the fence. Why are you looking through a crack in the fence into my backyard? Who's the pervert here? I laughed when I heard this. He was good at making me laugh. Sometimes I forget that Link could make me laugh. Man should be able to do what he wants in his own place, I said. And before Link could answer, I had climbed over the fence into his backyard. You okay, man? I'm fine. I didn't collapse or anything. I walked out here, and I can walk back inside, Link replied. I walked over and sat down on the steps to Link's patio just behind him. Good. Do you often sit down with your neighbor when he's buck-ass naked in his backyard? You're the one who's naked, I told him. But it is my backyard, my own place, remember? Man should be able to do what he wants in his own place. When he said this, he mimicked my voice and the pattern of my speech, but for some reason I cannot explain even now, I did not seem to mind. I don't have a problem with you being naked. If you want, I can turn away or get something to cover you. Doesn't matter. Nothing exciting here. Just an average guy. Yeah, you're not a porn star or anything. We both started laughing. Have you thought about what I said? About what? My not being a porn star? Cassie, the old woman. Will you let me take you to see old Cassie? Why would I do that? Because she can cure you. She's been curing people of all kinds of disease for as long as I can remember. Scary old woman, but she's a gifted healer. She can't help me with what I have. She's cured people of heart disease, diabetes, MS, even Alzheimer's. She even cures people of cancer. I watched to see if there would be a change on Link's face. There was none. She can't help me. What is wrong with you, man? What do you have? It isn't important. I just know she can't help me. Link got up and walked up the steps past me and into the house. As he stood in his kitchen, mixing a mimosa, I too walked inside through the glass doors. "Ah, your vice," I said. "Drinking naked?" "Nah, just the drinking." "You're gay, aren't you, Diego?" "Yeah, why?" "Most guys wouldn't casually talk to another guy who's naked and drinking in his kitchen." "You gay?" "No, Diego, not gay." "Then how did you know I was gay?" "This is California, Diego." "Oh man, I'm not coming on to you or anything. I didn't think you even were. It is just that my being naked didn't bother you, and you've helped me and worried about me. Most men don't give a shit about other men." For the first time since we met, I felt uncomfortable and embarrassed. I could tell the blood was rushing to my face and could feel the warmth of it in my cheeks. "I think I better go." Link could see me blushing, and something inside him enjoyed the discomfort he was producing in me. "Why? Because I'm standing here with no clothes on? Because you keep checking out my dick? I might not be a porn star, but I can see you checking out my abs and my dick." "Man, your skinny ass self isn't all that. I gotta go, man." "Why? You getting turned on? You want some of this? You hard, Diego?" As he said this, he turned around and said, "You want my ass?" "No, I gotta go because there's something wrong with you, man. You're not right." You would think I would have stayed away from this man, but of course I didn't. In this, I was as predictable as Link was. I went back. I kept going back. You could even argue that I'm still going back. Thank you.
Okay. Now we're going to switch over to our little talk show portion. Yeah, so thank you so much for reading from all those amazingly different parts of your books. I think between your three, so these books are, well, John's book is a novel, but then YZ's book and C. Dale's book are like, they're a collection of linked stories. And so all in all, between the three of you on the couch, I feel like they're like 50 characters or something. But yeah, so the theme of tonight is outsiders, and I was wondering if, I was thinking we should probably start there, and after reading your books too, I was just wondering, while you were writing, if you considered that you were writing from an outside perspective and sort of how you arrived at your characters and their position in society.
Okay. I'll start. When I started writing this book, I wasn't writing a first-person character. I actually was writing a close third through the mother's perspective, and spending a lot of time with her. And one time I wrote this scene where the mother and Pearl's father were having this argument. And as I was writing the scene, I could see through the wall of their bedroom and see Pearl on the other side, like putting her ear to the wall and trying to listen to what they were saying. And I realized that, like, that's what's alive inside the story. It wasn't this like annoying part where these parents are having this argument. It was this child that was wanting very much to try to understand where her place was in the world, really. And when I allowed myself to just embrace that, then the novel took a major turn, and I wrote from first. And so it was kind of like discovering that outsider. Even in her own family, she was an outsider. And then, of course, they're living in an abandoned boathouse, so they're kind of way like, out there. But that's kind of how it began for me.
And C. Dale, did you start with Diego first and then?
Actually,
Yeah.
I didn't. When I wrote the very first story of this collection, I tried to write it with an omniscient narrator, and it just wouldn't work. And I ended up choosing a close third narrator. And by the time I wrote the third of the stories, I started realizing that the narrator was one of the characters. And once I realized that, it was much easier to write the other stories and a lot easier to revise the entire collection. But realizing that Diego was a character that was both the narrator and within the stories is what actually made the whole thing come to life.
And it kind of took me a while to notice, actually, that it wasn't an omniscient narrator when I started reading, because the characters are so weird, like they jump out and you think like, that's kind of what you're focused on. And then you realize this person who's telling these stories of other people is like kind of unreliable in his own way. And you kind of have a central character running through the book, right?
Yeah. But I think I approached writing the collection as both an like unwilling outsider and a willing outsider in a way. So part of why I started writing this book was because I was in a writing class, and I was working on a novella with a lot of romantic relationships involved as metaphor. And my professor told me, "Hey, you're writing about intimate relationships between people, but there's no sex. Like, what's going on?" And then I thought about it. I wasn't weirded out. I thought about it, and I eventually realized that I carried around the state censorship that is very prevalent in my home country along with me. And there were things that I wasn't allowing myself to write about, and I didn't even realize it. And I felt it was a really insidious influence, and I felt very disappointed and upset with myself. I thought I couldn't really call myself a creative writer because I wasn't creative. I was hiding, cutting away, filtering out stuff. So I started deliberately trying to write about taboo topics like sex, obviously, and the treatment of LGBTQ people in Malaysia, just stuff that the government doesn't like being aired. And eventually that reached a point where I wanted to write about censorship itself, which is how the main character's story came about. She is incarcerated without due process for writing inflammatory poems. So definitely, that's what I meant by I approached writing as both an unwilling outsider and a willing one. I wanted, from the relative safety of my position, I still wanted to not cleanse, but approach the censorship that I had been carrying around.
I think your book also shows kind of how writers themselves, in addition to their characters, are also outsiders by necessity. In your book, when there's political tumult, your character gets arrested because she's the poet. And later, I don't know if you want to share the big reveal. Is that okay? Yeah, it's discovered that the poems she's being arrested for, a white writer wrote with an Asian pseudonym. So she's not actually the writer of these revolutionary poems, but all of a sudden, she becomes this really notorious media figure, this young person who's really a subversive writer when it's not totally her identity. But certainly what you're saying is true. All societies face certain levels of censorship. And, by definition, a writer kind of becomes an outsider by sort of resisting, a dominant narrative of what this nation should be. And I think all of these books are really good at that, too. I mean, Seedale in your book, too, they're very, post-colonial in a lot of ways. They jump between nations, and they kind of, these jumps in society kind of, I don't know, they make the United States seem just as strange as, I don't know, anywhere else, any other places that American writers don't usually write about. And I guess related to the topic of outsiders, a lot of characters in these books disappear for various different reasons. So I was wondering if you could all just talk about sort of how you thought about disappearance and how you imagined characters disappearing, and then also sort of how absence kind of starts to take up space and functions in your books.
I guess I'll start. I've always had an obsession with things being absent or disappearing that goes all the way back to some of the very first poems I ever wrote. And when I first conceived of one of the main characters of this book, I wanted him to have the ability to purposefully disappear and reappear somewhere else. But because I'm kind of an obsessive person, I very quickly realized that lots of people disappear in this book. One of the characters, Ricardo, disappears, never comes back. I've had many people read and say, well, where is he? And I say, I don't know. Link is dying, he's disappearing. Lots of people die in this book, which is the ultimate disappearance. And I'm not entirely sure why I'm so obsessed with it, except for the fact that as a very young child, I heard so many stories of people who would disappear in the middle of the night because they were taken by, other people, usually police. And so I didn't set out to do that, but I very quickly realized I was doing it. And I tried to fight it at first, and then I kind of just gave up and said, okay, well, lots of people will disappear.
With my book, Pearl is living. She's living in this abandoned boathouse, but she also has the opportunity to go to this like really gorgeous gated community house and or this community, and there's a way in which she's moving between worlds constantly, and in my personal experience, my dad's from the Philippines. I was raised here in the States, but there's being mestizo, being half. I wanted to write a book that would address this in a less overt way or explicit way, and so I'm kind of still utilizing these themes of moving between different worlds and what that means to the self. When you inhabit these spaces, there's a way in which the self vanishes or potentially vanishes, and so Pearl has to lose herself at times. There are ways in which even the people that love her see her in different ways, and she allows them to see her in different ways, and so she even kind of aids the disappearance or the temporary disappearance. And so that's something that I've just been interested in other work as well. And then with absence, the Pearl's mother is absent in her present life, but in Pearl's present life, but having spent years writing in this close third point of view through the mother's perspective, really allowed me this freedom to cut it all out of this first person as Pearl started trying to bring forward her experience. So there's this ghost novel that sits out there, and really I just kind of embrace the way that absence functions in Pearl's life. It was a necessary absence that she needed to have in order to live and fill it going forward.
That really resonates with me. Like the absence as force that you were talking about. So there's not too much backstory about the main character in this book, and in somewhat similar fashion, I had also written a lot more. And yeah, that's the ghost novel that you were talking about. And I eventually didn't include it because I was thinking a lot about how we either sympathize with victims of state violence or not. Like, oh, this person robbed a grocery store before they were shot, or this person was an A student, or whatever. And like the backstory is, it shouldn't matter if you are a victim of state violence. You are a victim of state violence. And so I wanted to see how much I could do with this character who is pretty much all you know about her is that, yeah, she, exaggerating a little bit, but yeah, she's thrown in prison. Like, do you still care about her? Is she still a character worthy of reader attention? So it was really hard to find that balance, but I wanted to work with that force of that power of absence, both her literally from parts of the novel and her missing backstory, and still make her decision at the end compelling, where she claims or she accepts the title of revolutionary in that she didn't write the poems, but she accepted punishment for them and became the face of some kind of movement anyway, if that makes sense.
I also thought, like, in addition to the characters being kind of different, playing with the absence and disappearing, like the settings also had like a lot of like feelings of like absence or neglect, or even abandonment. Like, you know, a lot of your book centers on like a town in Malaysia that like at one point kind of was a big deal, but then, you know, isn't Kuala Lumpur, and your book takes place in the rural South, and then your book takes place, a lot of it in Los Angeles, but a lot of it is sort of like working class communities, or you'll say like the desert, or like, you know, the barrio, or even like LAX. So, and then, you know, they're also, like, as I said, these post-colonial novels where like they shift between, you know, the United States and like their country of origin. So I was wondering how you thought about dislocation through setting, or if you thought about outsiderdom through setting as well.
Yeah, I think my main concern was I definitely wanted to write about Malaysia, but I didn't want to turn it into a tour guide novel, you know, in the sense that here is what they had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. These are tasty, exotic foods. But I still wanted the setting to be real. So I wanted to write about how people both are nostalgic for a place and also really disappointed for by a place. So what you're saying about there's the small town in Malaysia where I grew up that used to be a big deal during colonization, but after they squeezed the dry of tin mining and other resources, sort of just moved on, and there's just like all this infrastructure that then was like, you know, peak and modern for its time, and then it just slowly became more and more outdated. And I think that ties in really well to a lot of how the characters feel. Who some characters feel like they have been left behind by the modernization of this country, or they feel like they aren't included by the rewards that the country goes to a few select people, and they feel left out. So I'm trying to use setting in that sense to work with how the characters see themselves, their places in the country. And yeah, it's kind of a disappearance when you think about a country, and when some people think about a country and they think only about the capital, or just the cities, or the tourists, the beaches, the like nice diving spots. And then there are all these other parts of the country that are just absent.
Your book also has like quite a few interactions with tourists, or they become sort of like background characters. Like I noticed that in both of your books.
Well, I actually think that it's very hard to use setting intentionally without setting becoming another character. And so one of the things that I was pretty obsessed with was that whenever I placed a story in a city in the United States, despite naming the city, I often tried very hard not to write about the things that everyone else knows about those cities. And when I place any part of the story outside the United States, I purposely never name the city. Like two of the stories continuously refer to the island, and someone said, "You must have been watching Lost too much." And I said, "No, I just didn't want it to be specifically Puerto Rico or specifically, you know, Dominican Republic, or, you know, I wanted the focus to be on the characters and not the strangeness." Whereas when I wrote about the United States, I tended to want to focus on the strangeness. So I felt like in order to make those places interesting, I had to bring out the weird in what most people would think of as the normal, and the normal in the foreign places that many people think of as weird. And I really enjoyed doing that because it helped to drive some of the aspects of the book. Also, the tourists. So I do know that tourists show up often, and they're usually an opportunity for the narrator of the book to be a little critical. He doesn't like tourists because he feels that they just come to observe and then they leave, and they neither add anything or bring anything. They just kind of come and go, and it drives him a little bit nuts. But
Both of your books, actually, I guess I just finished reading Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid, and I read like A Small Place, and both of your books kind of like reminded me of her at different points. That it's sort of like it forced you to think of like, you know, the characters are kind of weird or lonely or on the edges of society and are outsiders maybe by mainstream society, but then you'll get a perspective like of a tourist or something, and they seem like truly sort of out of the element, you know, like they're actually the true kind of weird ones or something.
Weirdos.
Yeah, exactly. And then I guess for John, your book, you know, though yours is set, it kind of has like the most stable location, you know, doesn't move as much as the other books. It kind of, when you're reading it, like the way that like class is described, it kind of, in relief with the other books, it just kind of makes the United States, like it kind of shows that it still is like a colonial nation. You know what I mean? Like there's still kind of a plantocracy feeling to the setting.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about the way Pearl understands the world, and in the opening of the novel, there's this moment where Pearl says, I know the river waits for me, and that's all that matters. Like she knows that the landscape is unchanged or can be unchanged as it sits out there for the environment. But then when you think about property, and you start thinking about like the gated community where Main Boy lives and his father having bought up tracts of land and people trying to put their name on these spaces that, and you know, it just that was the kind of the difference in the way the land starts getting parceled out. And so with Main Boy and the world where he comes from, the environment is just acquired and becomes implied through items like fly fishing rods and pictures of trout and all of these things, right? They're not really out there doing any of this stuff. They just have items that make you think that this is what their lives are like. It's like someone driving an SUV and never using it. You know what I mean? And so Pearl has to live in this existence where it's like she must work these traps in order to find food. It's a much different thing, and at the same time, she's able to then take a step back from even that existence and appreciate the way in which the environment sits out there. Even kind of a Robinson Jeffers moment. You know, you don't even have to have a human in the landscape. You know, it's almost perhaps nicer if certain humans aren't there, you know, that kind of thing, especially ones that would want to try to put a for sale sign in it. So.
And then there's also a moment where the characters walk through a Civil War reenactment. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So I live in an open carry state. And I also live in a town where people, certain people like to dress up like Civil War soldiers. And there's this, of course, long history of Civil War reenactments. And I've always been really kind of fascinated by the individual that doesn't, or that has the capability of not wanting to be who they are, but they embrace the life of someone else. And so Pearl, having to kind of move between these worlds and in some cases not be true to herself at times, I needed to kind of also explore that as it relates to this society of Main Boy's father and these other people that dress up like Civil War reenactors, and I needed them to mess up a reenactment. Because there's a lot that goes into these reenactments, and I thought maybe my outsider characters can go in and fuck some stuff up, and so, yeah, that's what we should do as writers, right? We create these situations that feel natural, and that felt natural to me. Yeah.
And then Wisey, in your book, I was wondering, like, when you were writing about, I don't know, places where the British used to live in Malaysia, or, you know, places where the tourists show up and they're like looking for the jail or things like that. I was just like wondering what it felt like, I don't know, to write about the place you're from in that way. Were there things that you wanted to like poke fun at in terms of like what people expect from Malaysia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is strange. I mean, I think I've always felt it was strange to grow up in what are impressed upon you by, let's say, your parents or relatives or friends. Like, oh, this is a small town, as limited opportunity. People, leave when they can, and then you see these like busloads of tourists come in. They visit the country's first jail, and it's still working. And there are like real prisoners in there, and people just stand outside looking at this ugly concrete block. It's all very strange that when you grow up, you're told like, okay, the opportunities are outside, and people come to look at the bad stuff, which is what colonization has left us, just really old stuff that we're still hanging on to for some reason. So I think it was natural for me, like maybe that part was more autobiographical, came a little easier. To write about what it feels like to live in a town with daily reminders of history that other people can then get back on that bus and leave, but you're like stuck with it. People ask you directions for how to get there. You're the expert hanging on to all of these things. Yeah. So.
There's a part I really like in YZ's book where the character's describing, I guess, like two different parks in Malaysia, and one is named Cameron Highlands and one is called Maxwell Hill. And the Cameron Highlands is like really successful, and it like they have rose gardens and it's not as hot, and it like makes you really feel like you're in England or something. And then Maxwell Hill is sort of like, unmanicured, really wild, really hot, and it's like, kind of a forgotten or failed tourist destination. Right. So I love the way you just like played with like sort of your reader's own expectations, throughout the book, and the way that's used in setting. Like I feel like in all these books there's like a lot of interesting play with like naming and mistaken identities. And I feel like that might have something to do with you all also being poets or something, maybe, I don't know. That was kind of the last question I wanted to ask before we open it up. Just kind of your use of language, and how does poetry or writing poetry influence your writing in general, and how did it influence the way that you wrote these books, or does that kind of feel like separate practices that you kind of go back and forth?
I still go back and forth. I still write both. I joked to someone that the reason I wrote this book was that I had been trying to write some of the things in it as poems for over 2 decades, and it never worked. And I mean, once I actually started writing this, it was very clear to me why it never worked. It was in the wrong form. It's not, I can think of other poets who manage narrative and could maybe pull it off, but I couldn't. But I don't know that poetry prepared me to write it. But like I tell my students, fiction writers, poets, we use words, sentences, image, setting. We use a lot of the same tools. The proportion of things is different. But I guess what I missed for many years was that I needed a lot more time and more plot to get what I wanted done that I couldn't do in poems.
Yeah, I definitely was influenced by poetry while I was writing it, in the sense that sometimes I would have these sentences that I thought were beautiful running through my head, and they didn't necessarily fit whatever plot I was working on, but I would just like find some way of incorporating them, because I was in the process of breaking up with poetry. Sorry, I haven't written poetry in a while, but it was a reluctant breakup, so I was still holding on to those sensibilities.
But has poetry broken up with you?
That I'm not sure. Yeah, because I was obsessed with like confronting the self-censorship, and that's a very, to to me, you know, it's a thing that I do or I don't. It's not. It doesn't give me as much room to play as poetry does. But what I love about poetry is one of the things I love about poetry is the way you can see a connection between things you never thought were connected before, and the poet shows you the way, opens your eyes. And that was how I approach the link part of these interlinked stories. So like some of them the characters never meet, like the you know, even the time dimension of it doesn't overlap, but I was hoping that a reader could still see the connection the way that a poet opens your eyes.
And when I'm writing poems, I in some ways kind of approach writing fiction in the same way, in that I really want to honor the reader, and I feel like the reader, without the reader, of course, the voice doesn't come forward. I mean, and some of you who are doing PhDs or have doctorates in linguistics and stuff and want to like hit me up. I don't mean anything by this. All I'm saying is that I really feel like the language on the page and the reader are necessary for this communion to occur, and I really want to honor the reader's time, so I create images that I hope resonate in the reader, and the spaces that I can remove from the language are filled in by the reader's connection. Like there are absences in the text, but really that's the part I hope that is when the reader has connected with the consciousness on the page. And for poems, I find that I really take risks in that way because I feel like there is a reader. I don't feel like I'm writing something that then kind of goes out into the void and is never, goes into a vault and no one ever reads it. I mean, maybe, but but I don't think so. I think that there's a reader on the other end, and so I'm trying to honor that in the way that I do with poems, and it requires sometimes taking those risks.
Well, I think Wisey and I were actually talking about this before the event, that your book, like the chapters are like pretty short, and the kind of, it becomes like cliffhangery, or I think you almost said like TV or something. So there is absence, but very intriguing absence that makes you want to keep going. Yeah, I think with that we can open it up. If anyone has questions for these writers, I certainly have more questions, but I can let someone else. Okay. Well, then I can keep going. I'm wondering if you have a favorite character who's not the main character in your books. Is that a hard question?
I'll just say that, like, I wish that I could, like, have drinks with Dox and Fritter on a pier. Like, I love those guys. Mm-hmm. And I love Pearl, too, but I just would like to have, like, wine with Dox while he's just kind of hammering out something on this cigar box guitar.
Right.
Yeah.
How did you come up with the idea for them? They feel like so real, like that they should be like characters in a movie or something. I don't know.
Say that louder.
Yeah.
Like, that would be awesome. No, it was just I don't really know where they came from, but once they came forward, I didn't want to let them go. Yeah. I just kept wanting to stay with them, and when I was finished with the novel, I kind of had this separation anxiety in some ways, because I could just keep writing these characters, and they felt very real to me, and I think it's because I just kept trying to listen to them. like even with the other characters, I would just go in and just try to hear what they were saying and treating them as if they were right in front of me, and that's how they came forward. But I don't know if I could choose between Docs and Fritter, but I would definitely love to see both.
Kind of a
them.
combo deal.
Yeah, they're the com. They come. Yeah, you have to take them as a pair. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the main character's grandfather, who is in the second story here.
I was gonna say that's my favorite.
Yeah, he's not a morally good person necessarily, but he's a survivor. So it's a story of a man who immigrated to then British-occupied Malaya, schemes his way into becoming like a kind of a butler for some British employers, and both is really controlled and has his life messed up by his employer, and also in return really fucks their lives up. So not really a trickster, like, you know, maybe trickster out of necessity, but not like a for fun trickster character. And I loved writing him because I am nothing like that. But my grandfather was a cook for the British, and I know very little about him. And I was just trying to come up with the wildest possible story for someone who is not my grandfather, but who could have been my grandfather.
It's kind of a convoluted thing, but you discover fairly quickly in this book of mine that the woman Cassie that Diego's trying to convince Link to go see to cure him is actually the mother of the character who can disappear. And I became very obsessed with her and her family, and the fact that by the end of this book, it's very apparent that that notion of the sins in the family being carried forward. And so the minute I finished this, I said, well, I'm going to write one more story about Cassie. But then when I hit page 75, I was like, well, I don't think this is a short story. And then I kept saying, well, maybe it's a novella. And then when I hit page 200, I was like, well, I don't think it's a novella either. But unlike John, I could not let go. And I essentially went back 2 generations and started writing toward this book, which is driving me nuts at this moment in time, but I'm sure at some point I'll be very happy that I did it.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question?
Hi. This actually goes a bit more directed to YZ. You use the term self-censorship. I was wondering if you're open enough to talk a little bit more about that. Because at least for me, as a young writer, I find myself when thinking about self-censorship, I guess it's more about making other people uncomfortable about maybe the subject I choose to write about. And I guess my question would be like, is it something was like a moment that like kind of put you over the line, or is it still something as you continue to write, like being like, is this appropriate, or like why do I feel like it's inappropriate or something like that?
Yeah, it's definitely a process, especially. I guess let me backtrack. I think when I first realized I had a project ahead of me to address the self-censorship myself, I didn't necessarily think of it as a purge, but I thought of it as a confrontation. And I think at that point it was really helpful that I had really no concrete audience in mind. So I was doing it as a self-improvement project almost. So it sort of took a bit of pressure off me to not have to anticipate how comfortable a potential reader could be. And it's definitely a mind trick, a Jedi mind trick, that you have to both write for yourself and also obviously write something that is useful for other people, that other readers could relate to or would want to read. So I mean, you know, like a simplistic breakdown would kind of be like, first draft, do it for yourself, and then revise 2-word. more like a partnership with the reader, is how I tried to think about it, but really it's like, of course, it's more, the border is more porous, it's messier than that. But I think in general, yeah, the better you can hold these sort of contradictory states at once while you write, I would say the more successful it'd be. Hope that helps.
One question I also had actually was, like, have you gotten responses to the book from people who live in Malaysia? You know, like, I think I've read an interview with you where you said, like, you could move back to Malaysia, but it really would affect your writing, just like the amount of censorship that you would face. So
Right.
have you gotten, like, feedback? Does your book get reviewed there? Like, what do people make of it?
Yeah, I'm not sure my book is on the shelves, like you can order the book from online and have it shipped to you. I don't think I have I have heard. I don't want to repeat the exact phrases because I don't want people to look it up and increment the hit counter for this person. But someone wrote a really very angry blog post calling me things like, you know, B words, C words, very, very emotional response. And, you know, I think at some part, like when I realized like this book, oh gosh, it's actually going to be a book, people are going to read it, you know, part of me was like, okay, you got to steel yourself, this is going to happen. But it is still amazing that, to me, that a book can call up that strong of an emotion, sort of like almost ironic because the subject of the book is about people trying to suppress written literature. But yeah, I'm outside of the friends and family and the like one very extreme reaction. I'm not too sure what the reaction has been. But there aren't that many Malaysian novels writers in global publishing either. So I feel like even if this is like dissenting from the other novels, or you know something outside the reputation of what people think of when they think of Malaysian literature, I think it's all the more necessary. Like the more different kinds of books about Malaysia, the better. And this one happens to be the one that draws ire than we needed.
Right. I think another special thing about YZ's book is that the narrator sort of like makes a joke about her own like writer ambitions. Like at the beginning of the book, there's a part where the character's 28 when she gets arrested for writing these poems that she didn't actually write, but she said that when she was younger, she had ambitions to write like the great Malaysian novel. And sort of by the end of the book, she's like in jail because she was actually sort of like thrilled at the prospect of claiming to write these subversive poems that she didn't write, even if it meant that she was, you know, like a victim of state violence because of it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if she's like absolutely thrilled, but I think it's like her way of, in a way, having a relationship with her country that she didn't have before.
Right.
Like she feels disconnected from the country, but this is like a really perverse, you know, wrong way of saying yes, we are tied together.
Yeah.
You are part of me.
Right. I guess it becomes a stand-in for a different type of relationship to her country. Yeah. Does anyone else want to ask a question?
Given the theme of sort of being outsiders, I was sort of interested in hearing your perspectives on writing characters that you feel are least like yourselves, and what that is like to try and inhabit someone who you don't really feel like you identify with. You mentioned the sort of grandfather character being someone that you didn't really feel like you were, but I'm just interested in sort of perspectives from everyone else.
I guess I'll start. My narrator is a 15-year-old young woman, and yeah, that was. I know that there are readers out there that resist novels where someone is writing from the other, and I understand that. For me as a writer, though, I refuse to live in a world where the imagination can inhabit other places. And for me, it was less about trying to replicate this character and more about just listening to this character that just happened to be different, have a different background personally than I did, and that voice, like the voice comes forward, and it wasn't, it didn't have anything other than any connection other than just trying to graft itself to me, and when I look back and say, well, this is a 15-year-old narrator, yes, but there's a way in which those boundaries keep the perforation of the border that you talked about. There's a way in which I found myself, even though it's not me, it was me at times. Like, I don't know, like there's just ways in which I was like, whoa, this is getting really wild here. But I can keep going like this, these kinds of things. I just really wanted to give Pearl a chance, and it required having me, the writer, give up my intention, give up my ego, give up who I think I am in this world, in service of who this character is. So when I take a step back, I can definitely see the distance between us. But when I was writing the book, there wasn't much distance between us from my experience.
One of the characters in this book is a character that I actually despise. He's an archbishop, and he does really horrendous things. But I have to say that even though he's the most difficult character, I actually really enjoyed inhabiting him as a character. And it's almost as if you're given a chance to get on stage and play someone. And the first few times you do it, you have the lines right, but you don't have the gestures or the emotion right. And it takes some practice. But I actually think that in some ways, parts of us, the writer, end up in every character. I mean, I can find parts of myself in just about every single character, and there are a lot of characters in this book. And yet, the one that I'm the most close to in the book, I never felt the same kind of charge writing as I did when I wrote about the Archbishop, who's evil.
Yeah, I know what you mean about the evil character, but also finding yourself in every character, a little bit of yourself in every character, even with the evil characters. Yeah, so I think I approach writing characters who are not outwardly like me, by either being curious and wanting to fill an absence of the story, like the grandfather's story, or there's this other story in the book called Duty, in which there's a religious man who participates in raids, like literal moral police raids, where they go catch or they go break up, LGBTQ parties, or they go raid the hotel rooms of people who are suspected to be having premarital sex. So definitely not like me, but how I came to write that character was I was reading these news articles and getting really upset about the raids on transsexual beauty pageants, and there was a story there, and I thought about it. It stuck with me. I really wanted to write it, but I felt I could not write it from the perspective of the victims because I felt that wasn't my story to tell. So I started trying to think about writing it from the opposite side, which is the perpetrators, and I decided to plumb the depths of my own evil and see what I could come up with. Like, what would the motivations be? Like, why would someone do something like this happily, willingly, voluntarily? And I don't know. It's a different kind of outsider, I feel like. But I think, yeah, as with I guess in general, writing about characters who are not like us requires a lot of curiosity, and also the risk of the blurring, losing your own ego, like you're saying, and being willing to face down what is unpleasant in yourself, because that's where the characters come from.
Yeah, it must have been kind of scary to write some of these characters, I imagine. Like, you really have to look into people's psyche and say, like, these violent things that they're carrying out, they really think that they're doing it for a reason, or they think they're justified in it somehow.
Yeah, I will not want to write 200 pages of that character.
Yeah.
I'll just say that.
Well, I think we have time for just about one more question, if anyone has one for our writers up here. Or if you have questions for each other.
Sure.
I know you two just hung out for like a week. You must have been talking about.
I already know everything.
I'll ask questions.
Yeah.
I was chatting with Cedil earlier, so I'll ask Jon a question. I was really struck by how there are a lot of close shaves or like near something, like you really tighten up the dramatic tension where it seems like something really bad is about to happen, but then you also have the book title in mind, which is Let's No One Get Hurt. And I think it's really successful in building up that atmosphere that's like really suffocating but effective. I was wondering if you deliberately had these close shaves or near accidents because of the book title, or did the book title come afterwards?
He just likes to mess with people.
Yeah, that's the answer. No. The title came much later, and it came after when I would go back and kind of reflect on some of the things that were already occurring in the work, but I will say that line, "Let's no one get hurt," the mother, it's something that my mom would say, and I have relatives from North Carolina and kind of down south. It's you hear this line every now and then, like, let's no one get hurt now, like this kind of thing, and it's usually just meant to kind of corral the rambunctious kids that are, doing something that this is like pre-Jackass or something, but it's like they're doing something that almost could be, that could almost go viral. And so I think there was that always kind of just hovering inside the scenes. But when I went back and reflected, then I was like, oh, okay, this title seems to pull together a lot of things, especially as it relates to the mother being able to say this, and of course how that carries through the novel because of so much devastation that the mother has created as it relates to Pearl growing up. Yeah. Can we just put the camera on this person? Just dim all the lights except for the one spotlight on C-Day.
Yeah, I can't tell if it's a question budding there.
Yeah,
or-
that's just a general thought.
Cedil, how do I know if poetry is breaking up with me?
You never know with poetry. Poetry's a little tricky that way, a little stalker-esque. You think poetry's breaking up with you, but then you find poetry outside your window, watching you get ready for bed.
That's creepy.
I thought there was one of your stories that was kind of like a poem, though, or like the dual narrative, or like it's sort of like a screenplay.
Yeah.
yeah.
I can't get away. It was
Yeah.
a long breaking up process.
Yeah. I think it pops out in all of the books in different ways. Yeah. I think that's a good point to end our conversation. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you'll stick around and look at the books and talk to these writers. Ask them about outsiders. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming.